Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I will review today is A Man. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of A Man with a leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. A Man is a 2018 novel by Japanese writer Keiichiro Hirano. Hirano is in his 40s and represents the new 21st century generation of Japanese literature, with which I am not very familiar. The closest would be Haruki Murakami. I read a few of his books and wasn't impressed. They seemed a bit too commercial for me, but that was a long time ago, so I will give him another shot. Perhaps I missed something. In general, when it comes to Japanese fiction, I prefer more classical works, early to mid-20th century. I think overall, Japanese literature is pretty distinct. It probably has something to do with the cultural differences, Japanese social singularity and isolation, and there must be issues with translating as well. What is A Man about? It is about individual identity. Who are we, what or who determines it, and can we change it? And if we can change the things we identify with, such as our name or nationality, do we change how we see ourselves? And do we instinctively start to behave differently, influenced by our new identity? A bit of the plot. The story is an account supposedly told to the author by a lawyer named Akira Kido while drinking in a bar. It attests to the idea that often we are most honest with strangers because there is no fear that our honesty will be consequential to our lives and that we will be judged, at least not by the people whose opinion we care about. The two of us became something like friends. Making a new drinking buddy with whom you form a deep connection is surprisingly rare in middle age, but our relationship was limited to the counter of that establishment, and neither of us sought the other's contact information. Kido is going through a midlife emotional and identity crisis and is hired by a woman, Rie, to investigate her husband, Daisuke, who died in an accident. Sometime after the accident, Rie, somewhat by accident, becomes aware that Daisuke wasn't totally honest with her and he was not the person he claimed to be. So she hires Kido to investigate a tangled web of identity swaps that might lead to discovering the real identity of Daisuke. And all of it makes him question and analyze his own identity. And that's the basic plot. What are my thoughts about A Man? The book is well written, deep and thought-provoking, full of details and Japanese names that sometimes are difficult to keep track of. The novel is somewhat of a psychological crime thriller, but the question is not who did the crime, but who the criminal was, in a more abstract sense. It puts in doubt the strength of individual identity by questioning what it is, how deep does it go, and where does it come from. It's unbearable to have your identity summed up by one thing and one thing only, and for other people to have control over what that is. Another question is who controls each individual's identity, society or you, and is there a conflict between the two? Also, does changing identity create a new or different person? Does it give us superficially another life, a fresh start, a second chance to create a different life, hopefully better? There is a story of two English boys who kidnapped a 2-year-old, tortured and killed him, and after spending 8 years in the juvenile correction facility, they were given a new identity to put them back into society without being judged for their past, and also to try to psychologically disconnect them from their old criminal personality so that they could see themselves as different people, separate from their old behavior. Daisuke, the imposter, is the focus of the novel's identity dilemma, but all the characters seem to go through some form of identity crisis, the lawyer Kido, Rie, and even her teenage son. The main character, Akira Kido, is going through his midlife crisis, and the search for the real identity of Daisuke makes him start to question his own identity. How does it define him, and how deep does it go? And if he could change it, would the price be worth it? Because when you become a new person and free yourself of some of the external garbage attached to you, at the same time you lose contact with the people you care for. The identity question is somewhat of an existential dilemma. Am I who I want to be, and so is it my life? I keep myself together by living other people's pain, he said eventually with an indescribable lonesome smile. It's like the expression, the man who goes mummy hunting ends up a mummy himself. Do you understand what it's like to be honest through lies? I mean, of course, just for brief stints at places like this. Somehow I can't seem to let go of myself entirely. The other character is the wife of the imposter Daisuke, Rie. She doesn't really question her identity. She did change her life by getting a divorce, moved back to a small town and remarried, but maintained who she was through all the changes. Her crisis is dealing with a loss, her young son dying, and 10 years later, the tragedy or its consequences are still very present in her life. Through her actions and behavior, being overprotective with her other children, she is still trying to figure out how to deal with it. In certain way, she needed to find a new identity within who she is, accepting the loss of her child, but continuing being a mother to her other children. And now she also tries to understand why her second husband hid who he was from her, and how or if it alters the past. Does love even has a past? She comes to the conclusion that in relation to her marriage, the past of her husband before they met didn't really matter. She fell in love and had a daughter, and that's what's important to her. She was happy and has good memories left. She seems to be the strongest person in the novel. She stayed and dealt with the problems instead of running away. It is the author's way to underline the fact that women psychologically are stronger than men. There's also Rie's surviving son, who is another example of dealing with loss, losing 3 close family members, and also as a teenager trying to find his new identity. After having his last name changed from father to stepfather and now to mother's, he finds out the last name he received from his stepfather wasn't real, and this gives him a bit of a shock and even leaves him feeling cheated. This relates to the idea of sins of parents, fathers, and how they affect the children. In theory, a child is its own person and is not obligated to rectify sins of its parents, but in the real world, children have to deal with the consequences of their parents' actions. On the other hand, they also get the benefits passed down onto them, so perhaps life is fair in a type of cosmic irony. False Daisuke was trying to run away from the stigma of his own father's crime, and this was the main reason for his identity change. Initially, when he was younger, he got into boxing and became obsessed with his body. Perhaps he came to the conclusion that his body is the only thing that is truly his and he can control it, change it, and it could change his identity, how he felt about himself and how others saw him. And later he realized he could disconnect himself from the past by changing his name and assuming an identity of another person. The novel questions identity's relation to the past and the future. The future is constantly changing the past. The changing present puts into question our own identities. Does our past identity serve us in the present? And this is going back to Rie's discovery about her husband's past. Was he the person she knew, regardless of his identity? How much our identity does impact who we are? And there is a question of the individual identity versus social identity, nationalism. The plot takes place after the 2011 Great Japan earthquake, and the disaster have created a general identity crisis in the country. And many individuals have become less tolerant and more xenophobic, and it transfers into the general social condition, which further allows the individuals to express those feelings openly. There is growing hostility toward Koreans, which seems to happen every time there is some disaster. There is really nobody to blame, since it is an act of nature, but those kinds of events create great inner stress and tension, and people look for somebody or something tangible to take it out on. Kido, whose original family moved from Korea a few generations back, takes the intolerance personally. He wonders how much of a Korean is in him. He has a Japanese name and is basically indistinguishable from an ethnic Japanese. He seems to identify as a Japanese, so the protests against Koreans have limited impact on him, unlike his father, who remembers personally crimes committed against the Koreans. But he wonders if he was more visibly Korean, how would he be treated? He remembers past disasters where Koreans or Chinese were made the target of general anger and victimized. The Japanese nationalism has been a growing trend for a decade, probably the result of economic hardship. It was always present, but the earthquake brought it to the surface. When everything is going well, everybody is happy and good, but when problems appear, so do the real people, how they really feel, their true sentiments. Part of the Japanese anxiety comes from China's growing influence and the threat from North Korea, and some Japanese believe that in both Koreas and China the population is being taught to hate them. And I think also the memory of the pain caused by World War II is fading, and people are oblivious, forgetting that it was those very same nationalistic and xenophobic sentiments that brought the previous disaster. Further, this reflects general prejudices within societies, and it shows they are universal, lurking under the surface, waiting for the right opportunity to become visible. Something similar happened in Germany after World War I. Not being able to accept the loss and ensuing economic pain made Germans look for somebody to blame their suffering on, and the obvious choice were the Jews, since throughout European history they have been effectively used as a scapegoat. I prefer to use the word prejudice instead of racism, since to me racism seems to relate to race, and I don't think you can be racist against somebody's religion, nationality, or cultural identity. I realize people like to use the word racism since it carries more weight, a bigger punch, but I think through overusing or misusing it, the word has lost its impact and even has been somewhat delegitimized. I think the novel tries to make a counter-argument against the socially defined prejudices when Rie says, present is the result of the past. One is able to love someone in the present because of the past. It made them the way they are. Putting circumstances over genetics, intangible and unique versus tangible and general, Ria wonders where do the similarities and the connection between individuals come from. Her son is an avid reader, unlike his mother and father, and it makes her think. Our identity seems to be an illusion, maybe because life in itself is an illusion, and this would make death not the end, but the salvation that takes us back to reality. It is a philosophical statement, and this makes it difficult to argue against it. Going back to the conversation with Kido, the author says, I have not seen him in a quite some time, and doubt that I ever will again. He's no longer visiting that bar, no longer feeling the need to do so. I interpret it as a positive sign. It makes one wonder, did he get over his midlife crisis and went back to his old self? Thus doesn't need any more the bar therapy. Or did he become the monster he was fighting, in this case people who changed their identities, and became somebody else, a new or different person, and cut himself from the past? Does the plot answer it? The book also tries to make an argument against the death penalty. Japan and the US are the only two developed countries that still use death as legal punishment. There are two people making argument for and against it, but I think the author considers it unfair and unnecessary. He implies that the state carries some responsibility for the individual crimes by creating social conditions that lead an individual to commit a crime. So, if the state can be considered somewhat of an unintentional conspirator in a specific crime, it might not have moral competence to condemn the criminal to death. Instead, it should try to compensate the victims, which it doesn't, and reform the criminal, change his identity, how he sees himself, to give him a second chance. I think in general, we as society carry some blame for creating certain conditions that might lead to criminal behavior, but I still believe in individual responsibility for one's actions. It comes down to interpreting what had happened to us and deciding how to deal with it. But this is one of those arguments that doesn't have a well-defined answer. That's why there are so many discrepancies when deciding on punishment for specific crimes. To sum it up, a man deals with some complex social dilemmas. It is somewhat of a psychological thriller with a Japanese touch that makes it subtle and indirect. It seems to have a certain depth of reflection on life that to me only Japanese can do. Maybe because they seem to be disconnected from our Western society, its filters and values, and the way of seeing the world. But at the same time, they are dealing with the very same problems. Maybe because at the bottom we all are human and similar. The book is an interesting reading revolving around the question of individual identity and how it connects to the society. It relates to the larger question of what it is to be Japanese, and also in general to our contemporary society, to our individual confusion about who we are and how should we be allowed to redefine ourselves. At this moment it is our sexual identity, but I think little by little it will be expanded to include other categories, since it will be based on how we feel and not our biology. I think people will start to question their age, chronological versus how they feel, and then maybe even their race. I mean, we started with probably the most basic, seemingly the easiest to define characteristic, being man or woman, so it would seem there are no limits where we can go from here. The book's purpose might be to spur the reader to question his own identity, how it is defined within society, and if we can change it. How would my life transform if I became somebody else? Would it be better or worse? That there is a certain identity conflict within society. On one hand, we are becoming more individualistic, but at the same time we conform to and follow more trends. Perhaps this growing identity flexibility is some type of evolutionary response to the increasing speed of changing circumstances and changes in the environment. It could be our survival mechanism so we can continue as a species, something to think about. What surprises me about Japan, a society that thrives on discipline and organization, was how many loopholes there are for one to change his identity. Two men, 55 and 67-year-old, decide to switch their identities. The younger man gets a pension of the older, and the older man can marry his much younger girlfriend because he went from being 67 down to 55 years old. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a paperback which I transform into hardcover leather-bound edition. To make the cover I use grade A naturally tan hide I buy from a tannery in North Spain. It is the same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so it is top quality. I do all the processing of the leather myself. First I design the cover, and for this I use one of Picasso's abstract paintings, a dual figure, male and female, which can symbolize an identity conflict within us. This is the bag with the blurb, and inside from cover I printed a quote from the book. If you want to see a more detailed video where I explain how I transform paperback into leather-bound hardcover, click on the link in the description. I will make a maximum of 100 editions of each title. Each one will be numbered and initial, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up, since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100. So if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to leather, and if I can get my hands on the copy of the book. Now, if you're not willing to spend $100, but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel. And for every 100 donations, I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So if you are cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. One more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to win. The book itself is beautiful. Visually, it has a very nice texture. It smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So if you want one, don't snooze or you might lose. Well, that's it, so let's end it here, and until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.